Hello, everyone. This is a podcast about all things wellness and well being. And today we have Natalie here, and she is a wellness coach that is also trained in a lot of different modalities. And today we are going to talk about the topic of conflict, what it is, what it feels like, why it happens, and how do we navigate it. Before we get into this really interesting and deep topic, I'd like to introduce Natalie's background and hear how her journey has led her to the kind of work that she does now. Thank you so much for being here, Natalie.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So could you talk a little about your background in psychology, psychotherapy, and coaching?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So my story, I find it to be hilarious because it's one of those stories that the path wasn't ever very clear in the direction that it's going. I got my undergrad in psychology, and when I finished, I felt very clear of I'm exhausted of school. I don't know what I'm going to do with this degree. I'm just going to go out in the world. I have student loans to pay off and see what will happen. And so I felt at the time like all I knew about what psychology was sitting with someone in a room, them being on a couch, and then me interpreting what their experience was. And for me, that just never resonated. And so since that was the only, knowledge that I had about what psychology could look like, it felt like that's not me. It was something I've always been interested in, but that type of holding space and meeting someone just didn't resonate. And so I went to the workforce. And around that time, I graduated in 2008, and that's when the recession hit. And so it was very interesting year of graduating college and going into the workforce. And so, for 6 years, I was working at a company, and even though, I was very clear of like, oh, I'm not going to go get further my education or anything like that, I kept finding myself in spaces where I was holding space for people, essentially. I worked with attorneys, and I would oftentimes find myself in their office, and they would be sharing things about what's happening in their lives, and I would be listening and asking questions and basically being a therapist. And so after a few years of having that experience, I realized, I have some skill sets here that are very natural to me, and I should probably explore this further. And so then it prompted me to explore going to graduate school. And for me, I'm trained in a few energy healing modalities, and having a connection with spirit is something that has been very important for me all of my life. I went to Catholic school growing up, so I was very much in that like mindset of Christianity for a long time, and then realized I'm like, oh, there's some things that fit, there's some things that don't fit, and have always had a very deep connection with the earth, and have developed a stronger connection with my ancestors. And so for me, it was important to discover a way to integrate spirituality and psychology, because the more that I would grow and heal and all of that, I realized, there's not that much of a difference between psychology and spirituality. It just depends on in the way that you relate to both of those things. And so I searched for a school that integrated that had both Western and Eastern modalities integrated. And I discovered that when I discovered the program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. It's one of a few programs in the country that have that, what some people call transpersonal psychology, and at that school they call it integral counseling psychology. And so that's the program that I went into. And it was a really awesome program. It taught me so much about psychology and different ways of holding space. I mean, I was introduced to a ton of modalities that I had no clue about whatsoever. And it was a really amazing experience. I moved out to the Bay Area in San Francisco. And if anyone has any familiarity with the Bay Area, it is, well, at the time at least, it was over abundance of so much knowledge and wisdom and different healing modalities and just so many experiences. And I, went from the East Coast and plopped myself right into the heart of so much healing. And, I can always joke around that while I was in grad school, unbeknownst to me, Spirit had me in basically spirit school at the same time. And I got linked up with a ton of different teachers and Indigenous elders, and really found myself um, decolonizing my mind in a way that it when I think about like the time, the amount of like chronological time that I spent there, it felt like 30 years when it was really about 5, more or less, actually probably less than 5. And you know, it just, I learned so much and I grew so much. And as a result of that, you know, I found myself after graduating realizing like, oh, I was trying to follow the path of like going to get licensure, staying in California, like going that traditional route, and realizing like, oh, that's not my path. It's not at all the path that I was supposed to be following. And found myself actually being called to find home outside of the country. And so for a while, for about 2 years, I was traveling. Um, I would travel out of the country, I'd come back here to travel back again, and really trying to find like where is home, and also being led by spirit of different places to go, and different rituals to participate in, and it was a really beautiful experience. And in some ways, I'm still kind of in that inquiry of like, where is it that I'm supposed to put roots down? Of course, we're in a quarantine now, and so that kind of obviously slowed things down in a big way. But you know, it's still that inquiry of like where to settle down, and where to really blossom and make home. And that is a lot of what informed me in having this path of like, okay, instead of going to be a traditional therapist, and then so I'll go the path of being a coach, and also in that offering the healing modalities, energy healing modalities that I'm trained in. I'm what is it called? Certified emotion code practitioner. And so that's one of the healing modalities that I offer. I'm also a Reiki master, but that's one of the healing modalities I work with clients. That is the healing modality. I prefer to do it in person. And since we're in this virtual space, I focus more on the emotion code. And so, you know, those are some of the things that I offer through Tending Your Spirit is, you know, I offer coaching. I also offer group coaching and programs, and I additionally offer emotion code, energy healing. And I imagine I will continue to learn and continue to grow, because that's something that just feeds my soul of continuing to heal and grow and learn. And, you know, working with my ancestors is so important for me, because that's something even as I was going in school, I would say that's one of the, when I think of things that pushed me to go further into learning about psychology and really like healing and focusing on healing as like my life's work, it was looking at, you know, repetitive patterns in my family lineages and traumas that have occurred that no one really knows the story of, but like the aftermath of the trauma is so evident through addictions and stuff like that. And so that was a huge driving force in my path of like, okay, it's very clear to me that there's some things have happened, and because I have the awareness, it's my responsibility to like stop it and like heal so it doesn't continue to perpetuate in future generations. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing your journey. I think it's wonderful to have this kind of inquiry that you're living with. I think it either inquiry of like, where is our home or other things. I think it's really fun and adventurous to kind of have this inquiry that we feel more familiar with as we go on in our lives and like explore different things. So one thing I wanted to ask, if you could share one of your favorite personal practices that you do for yourself.
Sure, yeah. So one of the practices that I have a few that I call upon. One being, actually, since I'm right in front of it, when I was speaking about how I was like moving around for a while, when I was even in the Bay Area, I moved 5 times within like 2 years that I was living there. And so that was very disorienting for me to have that experience. And in that, something that I learned was that, you know, whenever I move into a new space, it is important for my being to be able to ground into this space and to ask for permission from like the land and the ancestors of the land. And so a practice that I was taught and then I started to develop in my own way was building an altar. And so Whenever I move into a new space, before I um, like unpack my bags, I figure out where the altar wants to be. And it could be a very simple altar, it might have like a candle and a bowl for offerings and, maybe some incense and some crystals or something. But wherever it is, it's something that helps anchor my energy. And for me, it's like my way of telling my ancestors and telling the like spirit, basically, like, you're welcome here. Like, you have space here in my life, and thank you, and this is a space for you. Another practice is going into nature. That's something that I couldn't even like, that nothing compares to be able to. And I grew up by the ocean, and sometimes just standing in the dead of winter by the ocean and just like singing to the ocean is something that has been such a powerful uh, resource for me, and working with the earth, gardening during this pandemic. I've been doing so much gardening and be able to put my hands in the earth and really just like have that relationship with this like huge being that supports all of us and supports all of life. And then I have, as an emotion code practitioner, I also work on myself with emotion code. And so like energy healing for me is like the most important thing, because we're not just this physical like meat and bones. There's a lot more going on here than what we see. And so those are, I know you asked for one thing, so those are a few practices that are really important to me.
Yeah. I'm glad you shared all of them. They sound really, really nice. And especially the altar. I don't have any details, but I feel like creating an altar has been a part of traditional practices and all people's like at all times. So it's nice to see that practice in particular kind of coming back into the modern space and the today.
Mm-hmm.
So that feels really a nice way to kind of feel at home or to build like a little sense of home when you're
Mm-hmm.
traveling or in somewhere new.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, it's been when I was visiting family in Colombia, in Colombia it's a Roman Catholic country. And so when I had my altar and my uncle came into the room that I was staying in, he's like, "What's this?" He had a lot of questions. It's always funny to, people forget, like, even the Roman Catholic Church, you go into the church and there's altars there, you
Yeah.
know, there's incense being used and herbs that are being burned, and there's anointing oils and blessed waters, like all these elements that uh, that a lot of people who have a connection to their indigenous like ancestral ways, those elements exist there as well. It's not something that just like popped up.
Of course. Connecting to the elements in a way has been with us for the entire time.
Yeah.
I feel. Um, let's move on to the main topic of conflict. So I wanted to briefly introduce it with a little bit of my own kind of opinion about it. So I often think of like conflict as versus communication. So communication seems to be a more positive kind of free flowing, like everything's going well kind of word. And conflict seems to be like this hardened, like stone, like something being compressed and broken and like just not happening how it's supposed to work. And also the word itself feels like real rough. um, so you recently talked a bit about it in a number of conversations. So I wanted to start with your opinion on what do we mean when we talk about conflict, and what is it? What happens during it?
Yeah, totally. I like that analogy they have about the stone or the heaviness, because I think oftentimes in a lot of conversations I've had with people, like in person and online and in different ways, like conflict is something that is so, just the word conflict is so terrifying for so many people. Like so many people do whatever they can to like move themselves around so they can avoid being in conflict with people. And, you know, in doing that, there are ways that they're abandoning themselves and what their needs and wants are. And so they may think they're avoiding conflict, but they're actually creating conflict within themselves in the act of trying to avoid conflict with another person, at least. And so, you know, it's conflict is a very complex experience. If that makes any sense. I'm pretty sure everyone can agree on that. But what it feels like is that tension. There's a tension in between people's persons, like ideologies. There's a polarity, and the conflict is that like the tension in between. You know, I think people's wounds are oftentimes, like when we think of like times that we have been in conflict with another person, it's oftentimes that our wounds get triggered by something that perhaps that other person has said or done, and it's our wounds that are really starting to communicate with one another. You know, when we get defensive with one another, it's our subconscious way of trying to protect ourselves or protect our hearts from pain. And so we lash out on one another. And, you know, it's something that I find we often get like taught. I feel like in our society, it almost feels like in a global way. I'm sure there are some countries that don't think this way, but I feel like in like a global society, we've been taught that, you know, there's a winner and there's a loser, and you want to be the winner, you don't want to be the loser. And so however you can, when you're in conflict with someone, don't give up your power or perceived power. And I think that's like a very limiting way of viewing what happens in between people, because there's, you know, oftentimes people are like, no, don't compromise, you know, don't compromise your ideologies, that's like losing. And it's like, wait, but what's actually the goal? Is the goal connection? If the goal is connection, there's ways to connect, and there's ways to acknowledge like, oh, there's wounds that are being like, there's something happening for me right now, a wound is getting, you know, triggered and is coming up to the surface, and is actually like, there's a story that's informing this wound. And, you know,
Yeah.
there's a
And one thing I wanted to mention as well is that sometimes conflict doesn't appear in disagreement or
totally
not in obvious disagreements. So there's so many layers of conflict,
totally
and so many different ways it can look.
mm-hmm.
I found that sometimes you don't even know that, you know, a certain feeling between uh, your partner or a family member that is a tension can
Mm-hmm.
be some sort of conflict that no one really wants to address, or
Yeah,
like doesn't know is there. So I think
yeah,
it's interesting all the different ways that it gets expressed.
yeah, because it could be a very subtle energy too. I mean, I've had experiences where I had no clue that I accidentally hurt somebody. It wasn't like, it was never in my intention to hurt that person, and I did. And but I always felt like there's just something and that's in between our relationship, and then that, and I have no clue what it is. And oftentimes, you know, sometimes that something can build up, and that other person may not even be aware that they're holding like they're you know, oftentimes you think of people who don't communicate that they're feeling something. And so time goes by and there's like build up and build up and build up. And like the next thing you know, something that can be very little gets like completely blown out of proportion. And it's because that subtle energy, which is kind of, it's a very like a discordant energy that kind of just builds up and builds up and builds up. And the next thing you know, it's like, shit hit the fan. Like
Things that
things are
overtake
not good.
everything.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And sometimes that could be a buildup of things that have nothing to do with you. That could have been like multiple people before you who have, you know, not met that need that that person doesn't realize is not getting met, you know?
Yeah, a lot of reasons and causes that can be going on.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
One thing that I wanted to ask as well is what happens in our bodies or to us in our emotional beings when we are in conflict?
That's a great question because it's a lot of different experiences people have, and not to go into like the terminology of like you know what happens in our uh, brains and the nervous system. I'll try to keep it like the simplest way possible to explain it. Many of us are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze responses that our nervous systems have, right? And when we get flooded with too much emotion, too much energy, too much whatever it may be. Sometimes people, they're very reactive, and so that's like their automatic response is to be reactive. Sometimes that happens for me. Like sometimes in conflict, I can be very reactive. It depends what wound gets poked at. But something that I'll experience is like my body will get flushed. I'll feel like almost the feeling of like fire going through my blood. Like my body gets hot. My heart may like um, beat like faster. Uh, you know, I might feel like sweat on my skin, like different things like that. Uh, that is, I don't often feel that feeling anymore because I've learned to pay attention when that's happening before the explosion occurs. And so, that's one of the things that in my navigating conflict program that I teach people is, learn to pay attention to what your body is telling you, because you can actually catch yourself before you have that explosive experience. Another experience that people can have is actually when they get flooded with, too much energy, too much tension, whatever it may be, their bodies may shut down. And so oftentimes you'll have experiences of people getting really exhausted out of nowhere. And it's like, it's just too much, or it's like their body just shuts down. They may feel cold instead of feeling that heat. They actually may feel cold, and on um, their hands may get cold, for example. And so those are not an experience that I've had to, I'm sure there's other things that happen, but as far as like I've talked to people about, like, those are some of the things that they feel. And another experience is fleeing, right? You might feel like um, it may be so intolerable for you that you either physically like need to leave, or like your spirit in a way like dissociate. You may dissociate. You may not be fully present. Those are other ways that people can um, experience like it's trauma responses. Essentially, it's like what's happening in your body when it becomes too much, when you get dysregulated, which is a word that oftentimes you'll hear. And so there are ways that you can learn what your body's cues are, and then counteract those by like, how do you make your nervous system feel like it's okay, like you're secure here. I happen to be a very tactile person, so I have jewelry on my hands, and when I start feeling even anxiety, like, because anxiety can come up when there's tension. Like there's anxiety oftentimes comes up because you start to worry, you start to have stories that are going in your head, or you get flushed with the different emotions that are coming up. And so something that helps me is to have things that I can touch that help me make contact with my body. Rings, sometimes I'll just put my finger around the rings and just feel like the stone's there, or um, different clothing, might like touch my face. Something that I love to do is tapping, and tapping the heart, especially when the emotion gets really, really overwhelming. It's something that just really, really helps me ground my energy back into my heart. And that's something that, you know, I'm really happy that I learned about that, because it's really helpful. And something too, oftentimes many people have had experiences of like, I mean, I've had this experience of, in, it's not necessarily when I'm in conflict with someone, but it's when I'm in the room and conflict's happening and I'm not resourced enough to like hold space for it. Like one experience is coming to mind. I didn't sleep the night before, and so I was like really exhausted and in a room full of a lot of people, and this very quickly tensions escalated. And I could have, had I been resourced enough, been able to like help with like what was happening and like facilitate essentially. But because I was not resourced, my body's response was actually to freeze in a way that I literally felt like there was hands around my neck and I couldn't access my voice. And in that moment, there was literally nothing I could have done I was trying all the tools that I had in order to like help myself come back to myself. And it wasn't till later that I was able to actually do some energy clearing and like wound like shadow work that I had to do to realize like, oh, what was the wound that came up, that like, what was happening, and what are the energies in the room that were affecting me, and all those different things. I had to clear a lot of stuff. And I had a lot of shame. And that's something actually that people who experience, it's almost like, it's when you shut down, something that happens oftentimes is they feel shame afterwards. And I knew like, okay, this is what's happening for me. I'm being flooded with shame, and I need to like work with this and to face this instead of allowing those shame, like, all those things that, how could you do that? You're a horrible person, like all those kinds of thoughts. I actually had to like make space for that, be like, okay, this is not true. Like, this is just what this wound is saying, is that, I'm not worthy and that I'm a bad person, all those things, but this isn't something that's actually true. And doing that like deep healing work. Sometimes like the resourcing or like the making better actually has to occur after the experience. Because sometimes we're just, in the moment, it's too much. There's too many variables that are affecting what's occurring. And so,
Yeah, it can be
yeah,
difficult when you feel overwhelmed. There's not really any space for you to like even feel any kind of like supportive techniques.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
um,
Like
you're right.
sometimes it's just not safe.
You
Like,
definitely need to, at least learn to recognize what's happening and then figure out how to work with that later. Because I feel like tension and conflict is a part of life, and it's like anything
totally.
else that's a part of life. It's up to us to figure out how
Yeah,
we deal with it because we'll
yeah,
have
yeah,
to encounter.
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to touch briefly on conflict and drama. So there's a couple of ways that drama can look
Mm-hmm,
like.
mm-hmm,
In my opinion, drama is when something is maybe considered out of the norm, or something that has tension in it, and some sort of conflict. Um, but it is also kind of visible, and it's like usually a relationship or event
mm-hmm.
or situation. And I wanted to ask, like, your experience of that dramatic, what you would call as a dramatic situation, and
Mm-hmm.
how conflict comes into that and shows up.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of, do you have an example that you can help
So
illustrate?
what I would call dramatic situation is like someone's getting so uncomfortable and so much tension, it's kind of like a blow up, like people are screaming at each other, like throwing things,
Mm-hmm.
or like a drug addict not having their drugs, and it's just like out of their mind and body and everything, like
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
huge level of anxiety, or what you would call, if you would see, like, you go see a drama in theater, you would
Mm-hmm.
expect like a really big conflict, some kind of
Mm-hmm.
huge discussion with some kind of like huge rupture happening and then resolution
Yeah.
maybe. So I find that interesting because, like, there's conflict there, but like, how does drama and conflict tend to go together a lot, but also
Mm-hmm.
conflict doesn't have to have drama.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to know, with your experience with clients and yourself and just your background, how do you see drama show up when conflict happens?
Yeah, I feel Now, thank you for expounding upon that, because it gives me a better like vision of what you're speaking about, and something that going to the example of like someone blowing up. I find that, I mean, obviously there's conflict there. When someone's blowing up, automatically there's going to be a conflict because there are going to be casualties to the blow up. And something I feel that happens when it's so dramatic, uh, oftentimes people, like, for let's take that example of like someone blowing up. I would bet a large amount of money that that person has been holding back a lot of things, like that thing that I was just sharing about impact. Like, I imagine that they, whether it's with that person or whether it's with it, whether it is with a long line of people, they have had the experience of having them, having been impacted by people, whether or not those people meant to impact them in that way. It's a whole different story, but they have been impacted by multiple people many times and have not communicated that. Perhaps they've even said it like, oh, everyone's out to get me. How many times I've heard that, many times actually, not even just with clients, just with like friends and family. We have stories that, whether or not we're aware of, that we believe in so strongly as like, this is the way the world is for me, and those stories, after time, when experiences are viewed as affirming those stories, a lot of people, they hold in this, it's almost like self-righteousness in some ways, of like, see, this is true, like, no one loves me, see, this is true, no one loves me. And then, because it's that buildup, a great visual is a volcano. It's like that tension's building up. And, that person may be, that dramatic thing that happened may have been someone saying something very, like, not dramatic at all. But it was like the straw that broke the camel's back kind of situation. And next thing you know, that person explodes. And so I think that's something that a lot of people experience, because there's not that, it's unfortunate. I was actually, I think it was the other day, I saw a video of a psychologist speaking how in our societies, we're so trained to learn about physical, what's the word that she used? Like physical maintenance, like brush your teeth, take a shower, all those things. But we never talk about psychological maintenance, like before things hit the fan, like how are you learning to take care of yourself? There's things that, I didn't know as a child that would have been great to know as a child, like navigating the world. Thankfully I've learned them now, so I don't have to live the rest of my life without these tools. But how hygiene, that's the word, psychological hygiene. How useful it would be to have those kind of tools. A lot of people they don't have that. They don't have the awareness that there's even stories that they tell themselves, and those stories inform the way that they see the world. And so I think that a lot of the problems that we have actually in the world, like at large, is because of that. That's why there's such strong polarization. It's an election year in the United States. There's so much drama and so much conflict. And it's just like, in a pandemic, like all these things, it's just, excuse my language, but it's a shit show. Like, it is intense out there. And it's because, there's that piece of, psychological hygiene hasn't been ingrained in us. So a lot of us are completely out of awareness of the ways of how we are being in the world. And I think that's why there's so much drama. And some people feed off of the drama too. Some people like get pleasure out of drama.
Yeah. That topic, I wanted to mention specifically American culture. What I've noticed is drama and theatrics has been embedded in American culture for quite some time.
Uh-huh.
And it's funny to me how we
Mm-hmm.
don't always like recognize that.
Yeah,
And all the different media outlets really take advantage of that because
totally.
it's, as many people say, like the media outlets are a reflection of the culture and the people and what people want to pay attention to. And then
Mm-hmm.
a cycle gets created. Um,
Yeah,
so I feel American culture specifically is kind of funny in that way.
yeah.
I think it's,
It's rewarded. It's rewarded the more dramatic. I mean, you think of like what are they called? Reality TV. I personally could care less for reality TV, but there's something that people like. It feeds. I mean, there's a lot that can go into that, but it feeds something in them, like also chemically in their brain. It also feeds something in them. But there's pleasure that they receive from witnessing this drama that, when you think about it, is edited to look that way. It's not the full, reality. It's not like you think of the movie The Truman Show. It's not like you're watching this person's life 24/7. You're experiencing an edited version of an experience that is forced to create drama. And in our society, I think, well, one of the things I feel happens is that it's a form of escapism for people to like get attached to the drama and like escape their own experiences of what is happening in their life. And then, the more that this experience of drama is rewarded by our money going there, because you're voting with your time, your energy, your money, is basically telling these corporations that, like, yes, give us more of this, like this. It also, I feel, feeds this capitalistic society that we have, because there's, instead of doing the work of like looking internally of like what's happening within me, you're looking for things to fulfill this like emptiness, for lack of a better word, that exists within. So then it causes you to like buy products and, support this and support that, and consistently. I mean, I catch myself sometimes doing it too. I'm not immune to this. This is something that I'm like very strongly working on within myself, of this like uh, my friend, she uh, is a spiritual bridge, and she's a diviner, and the beings that she works with, they play with words a lot. And one of the things that they say, they were talking once in a divination about consumerism. It's like, consume her. Like, that's, if you see, break down the word of like consume her. And it's really interesting. You think of like the way that we consume the earth and the resources in the earth, like very, like as if there's infinite amount, the ways that we're consume one another, consume one another's energies, like trying to consume her to fulfill, or to not even filling. It's just kind of like kind of giving relief for like a moment. And then you're back to like, I need to find relief again. And I think that speaking of like the culture of the United States, like when you think historically of all the trauma that has occurred on this land, the extermination of many tribal nations, and the enslavement of stolen African brothers and sisters, this land known right now as the United States, like, has so much trauma in the like grains of soil or grains of sand that exist, and how we are a part of that because we live on this land. So of course we're going to be, whether or not we realize it, there is an energetic exchange happening. And so that's only going to perpetuate more trauma, more, unless, basically, until we take responsibility of that as like people living on this land, you know?
that would be the first step, as I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think first is a practice that I've learned actually from a few teachers, is like knowing what land you're on. Like, I, for example, I'm on occupied Lenape territory. The Lenape people lived all through New Jersey and parts of New York, and I believe in Pennsylvania too. And they were displaced. They were, a lot of them killed and moved. I actually don't even remember where they were moved to, but they're not here. It's basically, a key point, and something that actually a Kogi elder that I had the opportunity to learn from expressed was the importance of learning, the land that you were born on and the land that you're existing in. Who are the original people of the land? Before all the trauma, before Christopher Columbus and all the colonizers and all their bullshit came onto this land, like, who were here first? They had a very deep connection with the earth. They understood the natural order of things. Something he shared was, we're talking about the times when people were they would what's the word? They would pilgrimage. They would have, like, you go here in the summer, you go here in the winter. They had their routes, and that there's there's sacred places that are. I mean, I'm sure where I'm living, this is the place where I grew up. I'm sure those sacred places are probably covered up by shopping centers. There's a ton of them here. There's a ton of houses, but there's sacred spaces that are energetic. You could think of, like, if you think of, like, acupuncture, they're like energetic acupuncture points of the earth. And those places haven't been tended to. Something that I learned that is very important is learning about offerings. How do you as a human utilize your resources and your agency and make offerings? It's something earlier when we were talking about resources, that's something that I do often, if not every single day, is make offerings, whether it's to the earth, whether it's to my ancestors. I live really close to the ocean, and so I love, since I was a child, love going to the ocean, and I'll bring flowers to the goddess of the ocean, Yemaya, and I'll sing to her. I'll go to the beach in the cold of winter and just sit there and be. And it's something that is important, not only for myself as a human, but I feel important for these places because they are sacred places. We have been taught many times to believe that we're all separate, but there's, I was listening to a training on trauma, and the psychologist, gosh, what's his name? I can't think of his name right now, but he was talking about the trauma of separation. It's something that we all experience, whether or not we have words for that. But the ideology that we've been trained that we're separate from one another, that we're separate from the earth that we stand on, from the tree that's next to us. It sounds very woo-woo, but the matter of fact, if you look at life as energy, everything has energy. Even this computer that I'm talking to you on has energy. There are crystals that are very part of this being that is a computer. And, there's the importance of reclaiming that. There's a ton of people who do really beautiful work on decolonization, which I feel everyone can benefit from. There's a lot of people that do awesome work with decolonization that it really, I feel, is something that, when you think of reclaiming the soul of this land that is known as the United States of America, we all have to do our part. And actually, and I miss this part, which is the key to that, to your question of how do we, is do your own work. Like, actually take responsibility for yourself. Because, there's the truth of the matter is not everyone is willing to heal themselves. I have, not to put my family members on blast, but I have a ton of family members that are just unwilling to do their healing work. And I've had to learn to be okay with that. That is their choice. Everyone is allowed to choose whatever path they want to walk on. It would be very egotistical of me to think that I can make anyone else do anything. Like, who the hell am I to think I could do that? It is, the invitation is there for everyone to take responsibility for their own healing. And something that I see that is honestly very like awe-inspiring is the way that focusing on your own healing, how that ripples even to those who may never want to do their own healing, just to the matter that they're in your life. There is a very subtle, um, you think of like a little light can turn on in their soul just by being in your presence, because you're choosing to do your own healing work, and you're choosing to do it for the mere fact that you want to heal, not because of anything else, you know.
Yeah.
That's it.
I feel that is so good to mention and talk about in terms of how you make yourself feel in a way through the kinds of um, work that you do for yourself that will definitely influence everything around you. So
Mm-hmm.
we never have control or agency over others, but
Mm-hmm.
the more we, find new conditioning for ourselves in a way,
Mm-hmm.
that will change our fields. And our field determines um, one of the ways that people will interact with us. So I feel that's so important.
Totally.
I wanted to know how we could talk about conflict as an actual tool in our lives and doing inner work for ourselves.
Yeah, I love that question. I love it because, going back to what you said in the beginning of this conversation, how when people hear the word conflict, it's like, it's almost like repellent, you know, because it brings up so much. There's just so much there. And it is a tool. It's probably one of the most powerful tools that we have access to, should we choose to see it that way. And in particularly, you know, something that I've come to learn is that, you know, triggers are, they're information. You know, when we get triggered, and you get triggered in conflict, and you get triggered in tension, when you get triggered and you're anxious, like, this is like across the bat. Triggers are important um, information givers that should you choose to explore them, give you a lot of information about what's happening within you. Meaning, you
How
know, triggers. Go
do
ahead.
you recognize what's a trigger? I wanted to mention that before you go into
Oh, yeah,
a
that's a
lot
good
of
question.
really great stuff about triggers. It may not be
Yeah,
clear how to recognize them.
yeah. Triggers are, how do you explain this? Because everyone experiences it differently. Uh, you know, I can go back to that feeling of when we were talking about the, you know, how do you know there's conflict when it's not really like overt? And I was saying how like the energy can just feel off. Um, Sometimes a trigger can be just that. Like, I mean, I couldn't even tell you how many times I've been triggered or not realized in the moment that I'm triggered, and I find myself like hours, if not days later, fixating on this thing that happened that I didn't realize like impacted me till later. You know, because that does happen. um, and so, you know, triggers can show up in that way. They can be something that, uh, it's almost like if you think there's like a timer, and like the timer hasn't gone off yet, and then you go back and you're like, huh, I don't like the way I felt when that person said that to me. And I'm like, and then you go through a whole story of like, oh, am I being sensitive, or am I being, you know, because that happens too. Especially when, I find that happens with a lot of people, especially when triggers, they don't realize they were triggered until much later. They'll oftentimes second guess themselves and second guess their experience, because it didn't happen in the moment. So they're trying to like reason away, probably is the best way to describe it. Um, which I would say, if you're doing that, like, just, I would stop, because a trigger is a trigger and it's information. If you look at it in a very neutral lens of a trigger being something that's informing you of an experience happening at a deeper level, than is in your awareness. That's probably the best way to describe a trigger,
Okay.
because triggers can happen like that or later. Um, they feel like doorways. That's probably like as far as like an analogy goes. Um, they can be a painful doorway, or they can be very pokey, or they could just be an odd doorway that's there. But my point being is that triggers allow for you, should you choose to explore them deeper, to be curious about the wound that's getting poked. Something that I don't know why this is the image that comes to mind, but triggers feel like it's like that person who's poking you, and it just like keeps poking you until you pay attention to them. I find that triggers can do that. It's basically your wound is being poked and provoked and coming forth, like coming up to surface. And like there's attention that's needed to that, whether it's, gosh, it could be a wound about abandonment, and really exploring like what's happening. Why do I feel this? Why do I feel abandoned? What's the story around abandonment? The story may be everyone I love leaves me, for example. That can be a story that is coming forth from this feeling of abandonment. And it could have been triggered because the person that you wanted to hang out with said, "No, I don't want to hang out today." And that can trigger that, like, oh, this person doesn't want to be with me. This person's going to abandon me, Just like, that's how the trickle down can happen. And once you have awareness of like, oh, I'm triggered. Oh, there's a story that's happening here. I'm noticing I'm having thoughts. It's just those little things of like, it's almost like a breath of awareness, of noticing that something's happening here, and then being curious of like, okay, so what's happening here? What is, you can ask yourself, what's the need that's not being met that is provoking this wound to come forth, and explore ways that you can meet that need. Perhaps there needs to be some energy cleared around that wound. So many people that come for energy clearing or utilize something like emotion code oftentimes are focusing on a particular wound that was triggered by an experience, or physical illness. Emotion code could be used, and all energy healing modalities can be used for so many different things. But one thing a lot of people come forth with is things that got triggered, and I'll ask them questions to figure out like, okay, what's the wound that's behind this trigger, and like what's the root of this experience, and then look at ways that let's see if there's energy that needs to be cleared there as well, because sometimes some wounds that we have can be ancestral. When you think of ancestral trauma and epigenetics and how trauma gets passed down in the genes, some things like it's not even our lifetime, it's like our great grandma or something went through some experience. And so it's really cool when you think about it. It's like time travel. When you really start doing healing and you're looking at triggers, it's not, life isn't so black and white as we so long thought it was.
Well, there's a lot more information now, so it's more interesting for sure. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we're living in this really fascinating context. Mm-hmm. Since the Western and the Eastern world and philosophies have been like growing and melding and creating so many new interesting practices and spurring all these kinds of conversations. And I feel like there's always these layers of like a conflict can have multiple layers in itself. A wound can have multiple layers, right? And it just kind of takes some time to clear some things and kind of get to certain wounds, and then kind of move on to others, for example, or just to see like, what's the landscape?
Yeah.
That takes some time too. But I do want to mention that sometimes there's this conflict inside ourselves that's so quiet we don't even notice it, right? Because it's like the conditioning that we've known since we're really little,
Yeah.
And then as we become more conscious and we become more adults, and then we start to examining it, it feels so like fascinating and almost uh, like, of course, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of attitude, like, oh, of course things have been like that because I've been acting this way, because like had this story and it's been this like
Mm-hmm.
conflict inside me for a while. So I just wanted to say that, not there's some conflict can be super quiet, um,
Mm-hmm.
like we don't really notice it until quite a while, or and if
Yeah.
we're doing some healing on specific wounds, then we kind of maybe find others and things like that. um,
Yeah. It's funny as you're sharing that, it makes me think of, so this program that I created that I've told you about, navigating conflict, I broke it down in um, like 4 different sections because there's so much complexity when it comes to conflict. Because there's, there's the self, like that question you had before of like, how do you notice what's happening in your body? It's one of the things that I explore, that journaling trauma triggers. That's something that is like a practice that is in that section. And then there's also like the family ancestral, something that I learned, gosh, it must have been in my early 20s. I started to realize there were patterns in my extended family, and again, because I come from 2 different, like my parents come from 2 different cultures, there's different patterns in different sides of the family that I just noticed. Like I had the it's something very natural to me to notice patterns. Like I thought everyone did, but then I found out not everyone does that. But there's something about that when there's patterns, like being curious about that. And there's a lot of different practices that just in that section around family and ancestral to like really break it down, because there's ways that like our families have cultures, the ways that we're raised, it's a culture in itself. You think of the um, like the core family unit, and then you have like the extended family, and not even, this doesn't even have to be like your family of birth. You can be adopted and there's still the core family culture and extended family culture, and it's a culture that exists within like the family. And then talking about culture and community, there's another section of that breaks down like the community you were raised in and the collective as a whole, like what's happening. When I think of like I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and when I think of children who were children during that age, and then children who were born after that, like trying to imagine the world that they grew up in is completely different from the experience that I had growing up as a young child. And all of those things are going to impact the way that you see the world, the way that you relate to the world, the way, the world, how that makes sense to you, how you make sense to yourself. It's going to be completely different. The person could like have been raised right next door to me and gonna have a completely different experience. And having to unpack that, there's so many layers of unpacking that needs to occur on the individual level, the family level, the society level. And then obviously the 4th section of that program is for people who hold space for others, and it's just learning how to help heal conflict in community. And it's just like it is, like I said earlier, conflict is such a complex thing because it's going to be different for everyone, which makes it complex in and of itself. And then when you look at all the different layers of all the different things that occur that inform the way that you see the world, you know?
Yeah, it is very complex. Um, let's do something a little lighter to close the conversation.
I love it. Yes.
I myself can definitely stay on the serious track for a long time, but sometimes I try to bring something a little lighter.
Hey, I love balance, so I'm all for it. I have like a common analogy of like, I'll go into the depths of the depths like a whale, but I need to come up to the surface to breathe too. And trust me, I do it lovingly. I know balance is key.
So one thing that I loved asking the guests is, what is currently inspiring you?
Hmm. Let's see. It's currently inspiring me. I have a lot of inspiration at the moment. I have some really awesome friends. I'm a part of a crew. I think we call ourselves a crew now, called Gaia Cosmica, and it's a collective of healers that are, one thing that we all hold in common with one another is wanting to restore harmony on Gaia, on the earth. And we have a lot of different projects that we have created together, and um, we meet every week and chat about different things that are inspiring us, or creations that are wanting to come forth. And so I find that plugging into a community of people who are wanting to make this place a better place than it was when we arrived is something that inspires me beyond reason. Even when things, because I'm human, sometimes life is hard and I go through dark moments, even though I'm holding space for others. And it helps to have the anchoring of just knowing that there's someone out there doing something great to make this world a better place. That's something that at this moment is a very bright sun of inspiration for me.
Yeah, that sounds really nice. It's good to have community, and I'm seeing how people are starting to like find other ways to create community in a more
Mm-hmm.
virtual setting. And I find that sometimes this is more freeing because we all get lazy and we don't want to go somewhere. So yeah,
Totally.
this is this time is allowing us, giving us more permission sometimes to do
Yeah.
some of the things we wouldn't have considered before. So it's really nice to hear that you're part of this collective. That's really great. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you
And it
so
was
much too.
really wonderful to talk with you.
Likewise, it was a great pleasure.